Well, Lateline has learned that most members of a key independent body set up to assess coal seam gas and big coal mining projects have financial links to the mining and gas industry. The federal government established the expert committee earlier this year to provide impartial advice and allay community concerns about the environmental impact of CSG and coal mining. The government says the potential conflict of interest can be managed, but communities and some academics say it calls into question the very independence of the committee. Matthew Carney has this exclusive report.
Many communities across Australia fear the booming coal seam gas industry will destroy prime agricultural land and contaminate the water table. In the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, more than 100 wells are planned, and the residents believe their vineyards and the tourism industry are in the firing line.
If we get salt water or other chemicals into that water source, then we could kill these vines. And in this area we've got some of the oldest vines in Australia.
There's two things going on.
This group of winemakers and landowners believe they've been kept in the dark about the potential impacts from coal seam gas.
I don't think anybody has convinced us yet that they really understand it well enough and have a handle on the safety so that they can say, no, we won't poison the water supply.
To allay some of these fears, the federal government created the Independent Expert Scientific Committee to provide impartial advice on the environmental effects of coal mining and coal seam gas projects. But Lateline can reveal that 4 out of the 6 members have financial links with the mining industry.
These people have been appointed to scrutinise the impacts of coal seam gas and coal mining. You want to make sure that they're not getting paid by the industry and therefore might turn a blind eye to some of the more dastardly impacts of the industry.
Committee member Professor Chris Moran is the director of the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. In 2010, the Institute received $17 million, more than half of its funding, from coal seam gas and mining giants Santos, BHP Billiton, BG Group, Rio Tinto and many more. Another member, Associate Professor David Lawrence, heads up the University of New South Wales Centre for Sustainable Mining Practices. It's funded with a $1.1 million grant by Mitsubishi Development, a Japanese-controlled coal miner with significant investments in Queensland. Committee member Professor John Langford holds shares in coal seam gas and coal companies for his self-managed superannuation funds. And Professor Peter Flood is a regular consultant for the resource industry. The chair of the Independent Committee is Professor Craig Simmons. He says the committee is made up of distinguished academics with long and credible public records. He rejects any suggestion that the committee's work is influenced by industry.
On a meeting-by-meeting basis, members of the committee are required to, in writing, declare any conflicts, perceived or real, up front. We can either have committee members that are not participating in the discussion, not participating perhaps in the decision-making.
What's been happening is that those conflicts have been disclosed and minuted, but those parts of the minutes haven't been made available to the public. So the public still doesn't know precisely the conflicts of interest that these committee members have disclosed.
Federal Environment Minister Tony Burke appointed the panel as an interim committee in January. Since then, it's given the green light to all of the 13 projects it has considered, some with stricter environmental guidelines.
If you want to make sure that you've got the best possible scientists, you have to deal with the fact that some of them will have worked for a number of different organisations over the years. And that of itself, I think if we made that a complete exclusion on involvement, we'd end up with a situation where we didn't have the best possible people on the committee.
Professor Gary Wilgoose is the only hydrologist to ever hold the prestigious position of Australian Professorial Fellow. He says it's virtually impossible to find an independent expert as the coal seam gas industry funds and provides the vast majority of research and consultancy work.
The problem is to get the independence and the expertise at the same time. I mean, you can get the independent people, but they may not be expert enough to really understand the subtleties or you can get the experts, but by and large they will have worked in the industry, so they'll be conflicted.
Professor Woolger says many in the community will reject the independent expert committee because not all of the stakeholders are represented.
There's nobody that really understands, for instance, deeply how a farm runs or how an equine stud runs, that sort of thing. And that's really important.
But Minister Burke says the formation of the committee is a step in the right direction. He says when he appoints the permanent members next month, he won't tolerate any potential conflict of interest and more areas of expertise will be included.
We now have a direct line of communication from an independent committee which doesn't just have independence in name, it has independence in funding. And I think that's been critically important. $150 million in additional research money is no small amount. And when you feed the outcomes of that research into a decision-making process, it can only result in better decisions.
Back in the Hunter Valley, the residents remain sceptical that the Independent Expert Scientific Committee will ever be truly independent. Matthew Carney, Lateline.